The final element in our process model is this notion of accountability. We need teachers to make a commitment. We need teachers to actually promise to try stuff out. One of the things that we found is that when teachers just get ideas from other teachers at sessions like this, they rarely do. And one of the things we found very powerful is helping teachers make a commitment by writing an action plan. So it's actually making a written commitment to say, I'm going to work on this. This is something I'm going to do. I'm going to commit myself to do this. It does several things. It creates a record and forces you to think through what it is you're actually going to do. It's available for other people to see, so it keeps you accountable. You know, you've made a promise to somebody else, and they can check up on you. It helps teachers focus on a small number of things. One of the things we've found is that many teachers are often so enthusiastic about a lot of these techniques, they try to try out 5 or 6 of them. And what happens then is their teaching just deteriorates in quality because they're trying to change too many things, and then they end up going back to what they feel safe with. So in our view, you actually make more progress if you change a small number of things than if you try to change everything. And the other thing, and this is something that most teachers hate doing, is to say what they're going to do less of to make time. And the hardest thing of all, I think, is this notion of stopping doing something in order to make time for doing something else. And people don't like doing that because it involves prioritization. It involves saying, this is more important than that. And the hardest thing of all is to stop doing valuable things in order to do even more valuable things. It's very hard to do that. That step is actually, in our experience, very important. Getting teachers to actually say, yes, I'm going to prioritize thinking up really good questions, and I'm going to get time to do this by marking less. It's about being really explicit, because otherwise you won't do it, because you haven't got time, because you're already working as hard as you can. In our view, therefore, a good action plan would not try to change everything at once. It would actually spell out a specific change in your teaching practice. It would relate to one of the 5 key strategies of assessment for learning. It's achievable within a reasonable period of time and is explicit about what it is that you will do less of to make time for this. And one of the things we're learning is being held to these promises that you've made to the rest of the group turns out to be crucial. One of the teachers we're working with was interviewed at the end of a year of working in teacher learning communities, and he was reflecting on being asked to promise the rest of the group what he was going to try out through an action plan. And we'd used NCR, no carbon required forms, because we were worried that people might make these promises and then take them away with them and then forget to bring them back to the next meeting. So we used NCR forms where there were 2 copies. The teacher took away 1 copy and the group leader kept the other. So if the teacher forgot to bring it back, the group leader said, well, here's what you promised to do last week. And so this teacher was reflecting on this process, and he said, I think specifically what was helpful was the ridiculous NCR forms. I thought that was the dumbest thing, but I'm sitting with my friends, and on the NCR form, I write down what I'm going to do next month. Well, it turns out to be a sort of, I'm telling my friends I'm going to do this, and I really actually did it. And it was because of that. It was because I wrote it down. I was surprised at how strong an incentive that was to actually do something different. That idea of writing down what you are going to do, and then because when they come by the next month, you better take out that piece of paper and say, did I do that? Just the idea of sitting in a group, working out something, and making a commitment. I was impressed about how that actually made me do stuff. And I think time and time again we've heard that teachers have in a way resisted this idea of making a promise or a commitment. But when they've done that, they've realized that it's the fact that you've made a commitment to the rest of your colleagues in that setting that actually helps you deliver on the plan. We think that the teacher learning communities are the way in which these 5 principles of choice, flexibility, small steps, accountability, and support can be built together. One of the things that would quite influenced our early thinking was a model of knowledge exchange in companies developed by Nonaka and Takeuchi in a book called The Knowledge Creating Company. And what they pointed out was that most knowledge in organizations is much less explicit than people reckon. So there are facts that people know, and when people tell other people facts, then the other people know as much as they do. But most of the knowledge in organizations is much, much less obvious. And researchers tend to be quite good at dealing with explicit knowledge. So researchers communicate through journal articles, and they write down facts, and they communicate those facts to other people. And that works quite well. Nonaka and Takeuchi use this model, and they focus on different processes. So when one person's explicit knowledge gets given to somebody else as explicit knowledge, they call that combination. But they also point out that a lot of knowledge exchange in organizations happens through a process of socialization. Some people know stuff implicitly, and other people pick it up just by being there. There are two other processes that are also equally important. One is this process of externalization. One of the things that we've seen is that teacher professional development proceeds much faster when teachers talk about what they do. They develop a language of description. So often teachers only do things to begin with intuitively. When I first started supervising students on teaching practice when I was a head of department, I wasn't very good at it because I just say, well, just do what I do. And I had no idea what I was doing. All I had to do was to begin to talk about what I was doing. And it made me a much better teacher. I don't know if it did any good for them, but it made me a much better teacher because I was forced to develop a language for talking about what I was doing. And the complementary process to that is internalization, where you pick up ideas from other people, but eventually you understand what it means to put it into practice much, much later. So you sometimes get that blinding flash of, so that's what he meant. Yeah? I thought I knew what it meant, but I didn't really know what it meant until I could do it in my own practice. And so these four processes of socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization are all important in teachers' knowledge. And research has tended to focus only on one of them, this notion of telling people what to do. And if we're to balance the kinds of knowledge that teachers develop, then we need to work around all four kinds of knowledge conversion. And that's why Nonaka and Takeuchi identify these processes of learning by doing, of sharing experience, of dialogue, and of networking, creating what they call the knowledge spiral. So our approach to supporting teachers in making these changes involves those four processes of learning by doing, sharing experience, dialoguing with other teachers, and networking across different teacher learning communities. The other thing that influenced our thinking, and the reason we've come up with what we think is quite a rigid script, is this idea of designing teacher learning at scale. And the particularly important thing here was a single model for the whole school. I've been amazed by when I go to schools and the maths teachers are working on one thing and the English teachers are working on something different. And so what happens is that the model's not scalable and kids are having to learn a different set of rules in every single classroom. So one of the things we've been interested in is this idea of doing the same thing across the whole school because it makes it easier to scale, but it also enables the development of what I call a single conversation. The idea is that the children are learning to talk about their learning in the same way in maths lessons as in English lessons as in science lessons. They're seeing the same techniques and they begin to be able to make those connections across subjects much better through this single conversation. On the other hand, we can't be too general because different subjects are different. So what makes a good question in maths is not the same as what makes a good question in history. So you have to acknowledge that. And teaching 5-year-olds is not the same as teaching 15-year-olds. So you also have to acknowledge that. The other thing that the model has to take into account, I think, is that it has to be implementable in real schools. And particularly now, with this provision that teachers should rarely cover for absent colleagues, I think the kinds of models of sending teachers out to other places for professional development won't work anymore. So those are the kinds of design constraints that led to us adopting this notion of school-based teacher learning communities, where teachers work together to support each other's learning in a way that is scalable and, as I said, develops this single conversation. We have come up with this model of our teacher learning communities. We think that the minimum period of running should be at least 2 years. We think the ideal size is 8 to 10, perhaps 12. We're not sure about composition. There are arguments for having maths teachers together because then you have a much deeper conversation about what makes a good question in maths. We have seen that where a maths teacher is the only maths teacher in the group, and somebody talks about a technique that everybody else thinks is pretty neat, the maths teacher might say, oh yeah, but it won't work in maths. And they might get away with it if they're the only maths teacher. So what we found useful is to have at least 2 people of the same subject. But on the other hand, we also know that teachers very much value hearing from colleagues in other disciplines. So we still don't know whether the optimal model is similar assignments, mixed subject or mixed phase, or some sort of hybrid model. What we do know is that I think that 75 minutes per month is a minimum for this. Schools have tried to split the meetings, schools have tried to do it in different kinds of ways, and it rarely works as well. 75 minutes once a month appears to be the minimum. And some schools have actually taken one of their 5 in-service training days and split it up to add on to the end of the school day, so the teachers actually have one more holiday. in order to find the time for this. There is need for time between meetings for teachers to collaborate, for peer observation, for them to go and watch each other teach. And often there's a need to get exemption from school policies. Sometimes school policies are inconsistent with the kinds of practices on marking that teachers want to adopt. Perhaps one of the most contentious things in our model is this idea of a signature pedagogy, the idea that every single meeting should have the same structure. And people say, it's very boring doing the same thing over and over again. Well, it may be, but what we're beginning to learn is that when everybody comes to the meeting knowing what the structure is going to be, the structure falls into the background and the learning comes into the foreground. When teachers come to each professional development session and there's always a different set of rules and a different set of things to understand, people spend half their time actually working out what's going on before they actually focus on the learning. So we think there's a lot to be said for having a structure which is the same from meeting to meeting. The variety comes in the content, not in the structure. And so what we're suggesting is that they should always start off with introduction, followed by starter activity, and then a feedback session in which each person gives feedback on what they've tried out and gets support from the rest of the group. And that's also quite radical when you think about it. Because when that person is feeding back, the rest of the group's job isn't to tell that person what to do, it's to help that person do what they want to do. And it's really quite a different model. And it's not a top-down model at all. It's about somebody becoming a member of this teacher learning community to get support of the rest of the group for the things that they want to change about their practice. To keep some variety, we think it's important to have this session called New Learning about Formative Assessment, so there's new ideas coming as a kind of drip feed. Personal action planning, where teachers get together and say, what am I going to do next time? If you're going to come and observe me teach, we'll get our diaries out and we'll fix a time. Because our experience is that unless those teachers who are going to do the peer observation actually have a date in the diary before they leave the room, it's much less likely to happen. And finally, the group summarizes the learning. Did we achieve our objectives? If yes, great. If no, what should you do about it?